I'd like to remind anybody sa DPWH, you report to me.
Looking at the response or the lack of it. After back-to-back-to-back storms in a matter of weeks, the government's disaster preparedness is put to the test. A nation already gripped by the coronavirus, many did not see this coming.
Lahat kami dito hirap, sir. Lahat kami dito napinsala talaga.
After the shock, disbelief, and despair, a demand for accountability, a loud call for climate justice, and more cries for help. It is an all too familiar sound, year after year, one decade after another. Front and center, high-stakes accountability in disaster response, and more importantly, preparedness.
I'm Pia Ontiveros. We'll be asking the hard questions on stories that matter to you. How to build back better, a transparency check on the billions of pesos in taxpayers' money for disaster mitigation, how much has been spent, and how much more the government has in its coffers. The loud calls for climate justice as activists call on industrialized nations to pay us in full for the so-called climate debt. And what everyone needs to do, a collective action to prepare for unavoidable storms and other natural calamities. Our guest in this segment, Public Works Secretary Mark Villar. Thank you very much, Secretary, for taking the time to be with us today. Can you first update us, Secretary Mark, on the comprehensive master plan for these 11 flood control projects in Metro Manila, parts of which, like Marikina and Pasig, went underwater during the typhoons?
Well, we have a major flood control plan, which is the Pasig Marikina flood control master plan, which is done with JICA. Under the plan, it's to increase the capacity of the river to what we call, in order to measure it, ang ginagamit namin is yung flood return period. So we want to increase it to a 50-year flood return period. In the project, we do this by increasing the capacity of the river, putting revetments, putting floodgates to control the tributaries that enter the river, and of course the main is really the widening. In the end, the capacity of the river is what we need to increase. So kasama rin po ang dredging sa ongoing Pasig Marikina Master Plan.
Secretary Mark, let's bring this front and center. We all know naman the elephant in the room, so-called. There are structures built on in villages along that river. Are we finally going to do anything about them? Because, you talk about widening the river, you talk about dredging, but what are we going to do about all those structures alongside?
That's true. It's important. The flood control is not just a matter of creating flood control structures. It's also important is also urban planning. Of course, there are certain areas that are really prone to these kinds of events. Lalo na po sa tabi ng river. Yun, kailangan talaga natin i-protect yung mga easements. And it's one of the reasons why we do this project, is so we can, along with the revetments, we put structures so that the easements are protected. Because the more people encroach on these easements, the more people are affected by these flooding measures. So it's really, flood control is a holistic approach. It's not just building of infrastructure. It's also part of it's urban planning. Part of it is environmental also. Sometimes the flow of water comes from the mountains. So part of that is we have to also do reforestation. So that's why it's important that we have this task force that involves all agencies, because flooding is not just a matter of one agency, not just a matter of infrastructure. It's really a holistic approach of all agencies.
Yeah, well, you're right, Secretary Mark. Like you said, with water flows where, we all know that when water flows where it will. So there are so many things that are kind of a little bit beyond our control, but there are some that are. So are you saying that we are going to do something finally about, like, for example, Provident Village, Ondoy, again in Ulysses, you saw floodwaters that would reach the second stories of the homes there. What are we going to do about them? And about other structures that we know are sitting right by the riverside?
This is our approach is short, medium, and long term. Of course, the short term is to repair the existing structures. The medium term is to do mitigating measures, such as what we're doing now, which is including dredging operations, including these infrastructure projects. The long term is a massive project. One of which includes the Upper Marikina Dam. That's almost almost a 30 billion peso project that really, that really attacks the source of the issue of the problem, which is the water coming down from the mountains. When it rains, all of a sudden we have a flood of water coming into Marikina River. We have to control that flood of water if we want to really prevent or create what we call a 100-year flood return period, which is basically, when you say 100-year flood return period, it means that the capacity of the river is such that it can withstand a once in a 100-year flooding event, which is very rare. So, of course, if you want to do this, it costs a lot of money. But then again, ito investment naman ito. So we've done the detailed engineering. It's something we want to implement.
Well, Secretary Mark, let's move to Cagayan first, no, because we saw massive flooding there during Ulysses. You have a master plan also, I understand, for the major river basin like the Cagayan River, and this is science-based, right? Tell us about.
Yes, of course. These master plans, what I mentioned earlier, for instance, the Marikina that was done with JICA, and even this one in Cagayan was also done through international studies. Right now, we're doing an existing project there to protect into Tuguegarao City, which is a high population area. The Cagayan River is massive. It's 800 kilometers long. We really can't we can't do revetment the whole river. So we really have to pick areas, and we have to be very strategic in what infrastructure projects we do.
Okay, of course, the JICA study you mentioned in 1987. That's more than 30 years ago. But Secretary Villar, you've talked about multi-million peso projects. So may napupuntahan talaga yung pera namin and the work, no, both of contractors, subcontractors. Hindi naman po ito substandard. They deserve to be paid. In other words, sulit po ba talaga ang pera ng taong bayan? Because you talk about all these dams, flood control projects, no? Sulit ba ang pera natin?
Especially in these big ticket projects, we spend a lot in the planning phase, precisely so that we can make sure na sulit talaga yung pera ng ating mga kababayan. In fact, the NEDA itself, before it passes the NEDA, meron pa silang computation for the economic rate of return, which minimum 10%. Now, that means that whatever we spend there, obviously, in terms of the economic benefits in the long term for us, it's quite high. So, in that respect, when we do these studies, that's part of the process. So we can be sure that these projects that go through these billion peso projects that go through the NEDA have gone through extensive study, and part of that's really the discipline that we have now in these projects is to make sure that our money is well spent, especially in the big.
Yeah. Final question, Secretary Mark, because we need to wrap up. Siyempre, si Presidente nga nagagalit sa corruption sa DPWH and yung ahensya, no? You created this 5-man task force about a month ago, and I wanted to know, and let's zero in, no, let's focus on the projects that impact the areas that went underwater during Typhoons Rolly and Ulysses. Meron po ba kayong nakita na anomalya doon sa mga proyekto, doon sa mga areas kung saan
I wouldn't say anomalya. I mean, of course, there were structures that are damaged. We have yet to see anything that was questionable, but nevertheless, we're very strict with these. In fact, our system for monitoring projects is very efficient now, especially with we do satellite monitoring of our projects, geotagging. These things make it very difficult for contractors to shortcut. Nevertheless, it's not impossible, and that's something that we're always. We're constantly improving our ways of monitoring, and but so far when we look at the projects, when we look at the revetments, they stood. But nevertheless, when you're talking about Mother Nature, there's always sometimes damages do occur, but nevertheless, we keep our eyes out for these kinds of below standard projects. But so far, we haven't seen anything major. But rest assured. If we do have complaints, we definitely investigate them immediately.
Secretary Mark Villar of the Department of Public Works and Highways, thank you very much, sir, for joining us on the show. Front and center of the program today, high-stakes accountability in disaster response, seeking transparency in flood control plans to build back better. Up next, calls for climate justice and developing a model for disaster preparedness to save lives. Here on Front and Center, we look at the big picture to better understand the issues that matter. I'm PAOLO Alkazaren. The third-class municipality of Alcala in Cagayan province is an hour and a half away from the provincial capital, Tuguegarao City. In Alcala, the Pare River Madre meets the big Cagayan River, and the rest is an all-too-familiar story year in and year out, decade in and decade out. Now multiply that story in many other areas. Step back and see the big picture. We speak now to the town's Mayor, Christina Antonio, and joining us also is Aksyon Klima Pilipinas convener, Rodney Galicia. Good evening to the both of you, but I'm going to speak first to Mayor Christina Antonio. Mayor Antonio, thank you on the show. Can you explain to us first, as briefly as you can, ma'am, I hope, the geography of Alcala and the two rivers that run through it?
Yes, thank you for the chance to speak, Pia. Here in Alcala, we are uniquely situated in a not so good way with respect to flooding, because Alcala is where the Pared River, which is tributary of the Cagayan River, meets the big river, the Cagayan River. And so there is a natural rise in water level here in our town at that confluence. So even during the dry season, there is an increase in water level at that junction. And then just right after our town, but near enough, there is also the Chico River that meets the Cagayan River. And most importantly, here in Alcala, this is where from a width of 400 meters, the Cagayan River constricts to just a width of 150 to 180 meters. This is according to a study that was done by Dr. Fernando Sringan, former director of the UP Marine Science Institute. And these geological features of Alcala,
Yes,
with respect to the Cagayan River, these are major factors in the flooding experienced here in our town.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Ma'am, we'll go back to more details of that study that you talked about. But first, let's, take this by the horns and really bring this front and center. Because, the usual suspect is the release of water from Magat Dam. Siguro dahil ginagawa silang scapegoat na lang because it is the most obvious and because the video of the water being released was so terrifying. But you yourself said it so well, and we quote, "It's not just about Magat Dam protocols, although in our state of despair, Magat Dam is the most visible target. It's about us. It's the way we live, as if we are apart from nature, as if what we do does not come back to us. It is us, how we have cut our trees, destroyed our forests, soil, groundwater, how we have eaten up the land with farms and buildings." What brought you, ma'am, to say that, to write that?
That was my insight, reading and understanding the study that was done by Dr. Fernando Sringan here in our town, Alcala, with respect to flooding. It was explained in that study that the problem of flooding and riverbank erosion here in Alcala and in Cagayan is not really attributable to just one cause, but it is due to a confluence of factors, such as what I have written in that post that reached many quarters, and my realization is that it's not just Magat. For example, Pia, before Magat released its waters, there was already a swollenness. There was flooding already here in the Cagayan River in our town. That was because of the many typhoons that have gone before Ulysses, and the water level has risen at that point that Magat released its waters. And in the study that was done by Dr. Siringan, the study pointed out that one of the factors is that there is this sudden constriction in our town from 400 meters to 180 meters only with respect to the Cagayan River. So there is a bottleneck. So that's one factor. And then the other factor is, as I have explained, the Pared River meets the Cagayan River here in our town. So that is another outlet for water to come here to our town. Plus, when we experienced this big flood, the water literally came from everywhere, Iya. And that water came from the mountains. And it's not just water, but water mixed with sediment. And that is because when water is released from the heavens and they drop on the land, and there are no trees to hold the water, to regulate the water release, the runoff, the water mixes with sediment, and all that ends up in our streams and rivers. And so it is really about us. It's about approaching the problem as a complex problem, which it is, and looking for the right combination of interventions to implement so that we address the problem long term. And it is not just the work of government, it's not just the work of the local governments or the national government, but it's everyone. There are many reasons for example, the denudation of our forests. It's not just the illegal loggers, it's not just logging, but agricultural practices also come into play, because instead of trees, you have yellow corn.
Yes. Well, Mayor
on our
Antonio,
slopes.
yes, I understand you have very interesting interventions. I wish we had more time to go through all of them. But in one or two sentences, can you tell us how determined are you to do these interventions based on the findings of the scientists, Sina Dr. Siringan and the other one? How determined are you to do that? And what else do you need to consider when you talk about these interventions?
We are committed to the study. We believe in the recommendations of Dr. Siringan in the study. And so the recommendations that we can do ourselves, what the LGU can do itself, we've already started to implement, such as massive tree planting and growing in all areas of the municipality, in the slopes, the mountains, the riverbanks, the communities, even the schools, the roadsides. Not only that, we plan to plant trees in a purposive manner by creating a green wall of native trees along riverbanks, as indicated by the study, so that we have a protected vegetation field. We are determined to do that. We are in the process of enlisting our townmates as well as everybody who would be interested to participate. We are sourcing native trees. That's one very important thing, because aside from being a protective wall, these native trees are really encourage biodiversity, and that's also important. We are encouraging our farmers to abandon yellow corn farming and the use of herbicide, and we are persuading them to shift to agroforestry, so that there would be trees on their farms, and that would be a source of livelihood. So those are the things that we're doing. But there is one thing that we need the help of government badly, and that is the widening of the Cagayan River channel here in the town of Alcala all the way to Lalo. It is a massive intervention that the LGU cannot do alone. We have gone as far as computing the work that needs to be done, the fund that needs to be provided just for the Alcala segment of the widening of the river. And it has a cost of 250 million. I believe that this amount is a drop in the bucket. It's a pittance compared to the
okay.
damage that we experience, that we suffer, that the people of Alcala and the people of Cagayan, all the way to Isabela, suffer. Because just here in Alcala, damage to crops and livestock, it's 52 million. Just this flood event. Damage to infrastructure, it's
Yes,
close
ma'am.
to 10
Okay.
million. We have not accounted for the
Yes,
partially and
ma'am.
totally damaged houses of our constituents. Yes.
Yes, ma'am. Mayor Christina Antonio of the town of Alcala in Cagayan. Thank you very much, ma'am, for being show. Now to Aksyon Klima Pilipinas convener Rodney Galicia. Rodney, your thoughts first on what you heard from Mayor Christina Antonio of Alcala.
Yeah, we know that the science has been clear. The science has been clear for almost 20 years or so. We've been negotiating for the last 26 years. And the mayor of Alcala is right that the science is clear. We need to listen to the science. We need to listen to the reality that the climate crisis is actually one of the bigger factors of intensified typhoons right now. We all know that before we got only signal number 1, 2, and 3, and now we now have signal number 4 and 5. Massive siya. Ngayon, kung hindi natin pakikinggan yung ating mga siyentista na nagsabi na for the last 20 years or so na magkakaroon tayo ng ganitong mga pangyayari, ganito ang mangyayari sa atin na dapat magkaroon tayo ng mitigation when it comes to greenhouse gas emission. But at the same time, magkakaroon tayo ng adaptation or pakikiakma o pakikiangkop doon sa mga pangyayari na dulot ng krisis sa klima. Yan yung pinag-usapan noon pa. Alam natin na ang Mines and Geosciences Bureau ay may binigay ng hazard maps, whether it is for landslides and for susceptibilities of flooding. Naandyan ang Project NOAA.
Well, Rodney,
Naandyan yung
in other
ating
words,
mga eksperto.
parang sirang plaka tayong lahat, hindi ba? Sirang plaka tayong lahat eh. Yung mga scientists, kayo, yung mga eksperto, the mayor of Cagayan and other local government officials and government officials, national government, who think the same way. But the question now is, parang paulit-ulit lang tayo, no? It's like a vicious cycle, no? We have a big typhoon, and then people mistakenly call it the disaster when it's not the disaster. And afterwards, we talk about climate change. We talk about what we must do. And then hindi natin nagagawa. Hindi ba? Bakit tayo ganyan? Ano ba nangyayari sa atin?
Alam mo, Pia, kung makikita natin yung mga pulisiya ng ating bansa, naandyan na. Naandyan yung Climate Change Act, naandyan yung Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Law, naandyan yung Green Jobs Act. But the thing is, from the local level up to the level, international level, alam natin na dapat meron pa tayong gagawin. Sabi nga, climate emergency. Bakit magde-declare ng climate emergency? Kasi hindi natin sineryoso for the last 20 years yung urgency nung epekto yung disaster na dulot ng intensified na mga typhoons, yung mga lumalakas. At sabi pa nga natin, yung mga plano ay hindi akma, yung mga development natin na ginagawa yung malalaking infrastruktura natin ay malamang hindi akma doon sa mga epekto ng krisis sa klima, sa mga epekto, sa mga delubyo na dulot ng climate crisis. Lalong-lalo na nai-intensify siya, napapagrabe siya nung hindi akmang mga plano ng ating bansa. Kaya mula sa level ng munisipyo, meron tayong Local Climate Change Action Plan na dapat pattern siya sa National Climate Change Action Plan. Meron hindi lamang, internationally, the more we need to demand climate debt, the settlement of climate debt, yung liability, yung accountability nung mga malalaking bansa na siya ang naging dahilan nung malalakas at matataas na level ng carbon emission, ng greenhouse gas emissions. The more we demand and the more we stand up that there's indeed an urgency to demand. There's indeed an emergency again to urgency to go back to the negotiating table. That's why we also ask and we encourage our government to go back to the negotiating table. And these are the proof that we can demand from them climate finance technology, yung transition na ating hinahanap, yung pag-finance doon sa mga losses and damages na dulot ng kanilang responsibility.
Oo. Roddy, let's bring it back front and center to here, no, in the country, the Philippines.
Yes.
What is it that we must do, no? Because we all know what we need to do. The scientists have spoken, all the experts have spoken. There are plans. There's a JICA study dated 30 years ago. Alam na natin yan lahat eh. So it's just a matter of implementing, of doing it. At the same time, what must we change in our thinking, no? Because kapag mahilig tayo mag-resiliency, no? Ang sabi nga nila, wag na nating i-glamorize yan. Hindi yan ang tamang frame of mind, di ba?
Tama, Pia. I think what we see yung gap dito, first is communication. We already know the science, but how we will communicate science and how we will communicate the technicality of disasters reduction management. Second is communication, yung una communication mula sa taas hanggang sa baba. Second is communication nung nalalaman na ng mga tao mula sa baba. And the third, Pia, ang pinakamalaking gap dito, yung mga plano ba ng ating pamahalaan, ng ating mga local government units, such as the Local Climate Change Action Plan and Disasters Reduction and Management Plan, alam ba yan ng mga tao sa sitio? Alam ba yan ng mga tao sa barangay? Naging participative ba ang pagpaplano? Not only yung ating Disasters Reduction and Management Plan, kundi yung mga local development plans natin. At alam natin na mayroon ng mga polisiya na yung mga development plans natin, yung mga infrastruktura natin, dapat ito ay climate proof. Climate proof siya. May mga polisiya na yan ang ating national government.
All right. Ronnie Galicia, the convener of Action, for joining us on the show. The stories that matter are front and center. We want more answers on the recent damage and destruction caused by back-to-back typhoons from Raleigh to Ulysses. They carry a price in lives and livelihood. More after a short break. We keep the stories that matter front and center. I'm Pia Ontiveros. Welcome back to the program. These two experts have been talking about the importance of foresight in managing disasters and preparing for them. We hear from them again. Welcome to the program, UP NOAA Center Director Mahar Lagmay and Environmental Planner PAOLO Alkazaren. Let's speak first to Mahar Lagmay. Sir, at the risk of making you sound like a broken record, what must we do so that we do not experience what we experienced during Ulysses and the other typhoons?
Okay, Pia. Recently, we came up with a 7-point agenda or key actions to effectively respond to climate change. And probably to answer your question, I'll just state all of these 7 items. The first is to mainstream nature-based solutions in disaster risk reduction efforts. So let's veer away from a lot of infrastructure and make nature-based solutions the primary disaster risk reduction effort that we do to be more effective and sustainable. Number 2 is institutionalize integrated natural resources and environment management. So what is important is that we have an ecosystems-based approach, taking into consideration as well the human systems. Number 3 is invest in safer and durable evacuation centers. Schools and basketball courts as well as churches cannot be our go-to places for shelter forever. Roofs don't count. Enhance interagency collaboration for early warning and response when the government and the public become entrenched in blame games. The opportunity for assessment, evaluation, and learning is potentially lost. Number 5, promote inter-LGU cooperation in planning, response, and recovery. Not in my backyard approaches must be abandoned. Number 6, strengthen the National Focal Agency for Disaster Risk Management. It is crucial for the Philippines to establish a standalone department or an OP-attached authority with the resources, functions, and authority to manage future disaster and climate change scenarios. And the last one is to declare a climate emergency, which is being done now in Congress to put the climate agenda at the forefront of policies and in the consciousness of the Filipino people. I'm taking this from the work. There's a book that's being written by Dr. Christopher Berse, Dr. Tony Lavinia, and Dr. Juan Pulhin, all fellows of the UP Resilience Institute.
In other words, Mr. Lagmay, what you're saying is let's not get in the way of nature. Let's get out of its way and work with it.
Correct. We have to live with nature. We don't want to battle it head on. Let's, like, for example, make room for the river, plan well. Instead of building dikes, you build dike, you just transfer it to another place. So you transfer the problem. If you are able to identify the floodplains, leave those floodplains because they're part of the river. If you can plan that, get communities out of harm's way. When the hazard strikes, people will be out of harm's way, and we're not going to talk about any disaster. So planning is very, very important. And don't fight nature where it is strong.
Yeah. So that, like, for example, in the Marikina River, we won't need a Marikina River warning system if we didn't have people living along that river. So your 7-point agenda that you just read, all these key points, these are exactly what needs to be done in the Marikina River system, Pasig Marikina River system, and all the other areas all over the country. Is that correct?
That's correct. If you are able to plan well communities, once you identify the problem, you veer away from it. And if there's really no other way, if it's a residual risk, try to do the structural interventions, the hard infrastructure. But first, try to address the problem in a manner that is nature-based, that does not force the issue against nature. I think that is the best way to do it.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you, Mahar Lagmay. Let's speak now also to yet another broken record, environmental planner, PAOLO Alkazaren. PAOLO, isn't it strange that every time a typhoon comes around and then the great flood engulfs us all, we talk about what we need to do and then we don't do it? What is Filipino culture?
Well, what I really would suggest, there have been a lot of talk about putting up new departments, and my suggestion is to put up the Department of Memory, because we forget very easily, and that we forget the next month that the typhoon had passed, and all of these problems that we discussed and the solutions are also forgotten because it's Christmas, and then we go into the new year. And by the time we get to the typhoon season again, this will have been a faint memory. So a Department of Memory is what I would suggest. But seriously, I agree with the 7-point agenda that Mahar just mentioned. Wherever it is, I'll sign up for that 7-point agenda. And what I could add to it is in matters of environmental planning, the new Department of Human Settlements and Urban Development has to take a mindset of planning settlements with nature and rather than against it. This goes back to the principles of what we call physiographic determinism, understanding the lay of the land and the natural processes that impact it. This is the approach where we can find the best places or sites for human settlement so that people won't get in harm's way. And it's a very straightforward, commonsensical approach once you understand the science. And this is where cross-disciplinary collaboration comes in. In the academe, we have to also engender this cross-disciplinary cooperation. So it starts with academe, but we have to continue into reality. So the DHSUD needs to reframe its approach to human settlement. And one other thing is to strengthen the NIPAS, the National Integrated Protected Area System. We have all of our problems start from the uplands, which are protected areas, but we do not have a very strong, we don't have enough park rangers, we don't have people watching over these areas that we should be protecting. I mean, technology is already there that we can keep an eye on everything remotely. But there are, of course, forces that don't want us to look over their shoulder. That's why a lot of these things happen, is because nobody wants to be monitored, and monitoring is key. That's the first thing. And once we get the DNR to enforce protection of these protected areas, then that's a good start. But everything else, then the 7-point agenda that Mahar stated, that's it. We don't have to state anything more.
Okay, well, it's so good to hear you say that, Paolo, and to be reminded, because after all, we do have this tendency to forget. And that's why you say that maybe we should have a Department of Memory. But basically what you're saying also is that let's not put people in harm's way so that we don't need to rescue them when there is a typhoon. But anyway, thank you very much to our guests in this portion of the show, Mahar Lagmay and Paolo Alkazaren, and also thank you to our guests earlier, DPWH Secretary Mark Villar and Mayor Christina Antonio of the town of Alcala in Cagayan, and Rodi Galicia of Aksyon Klima Pilipinas. Thank you all. Well, depending where you are in the world, they're called hurricanes or cyclones. Here in the Philippines and in countries located northwest of the Pacific Ocean, we call these storms typhoons. The word typhoon comes from the Chinese typhoon. It means strong wind. And the stronger the winds and the heavier the rains it brings, the more destructive it becomes, aggravated even further by climate change, whether you believe in it or not. But typhoons, in and of themselves, are not the disasters. So please stop calling them that. Natural hazards. It is nature taking its course. And the disaster is what it creates when we get in the way and do not prepare for or mitigate the risks. In very simple language, that means, as Mahar Lagmay and Paolo Alkazaren have said and explained so well over and over again, it's not building on riverbanks, it's not denuding our forests and watersheds, not gobbling up all the space we see. Mayor Antonio said it best: money to mitigate the risks. Where is it? That is money that belongs to the people, and it's not for anyone to give or win an election with. Someone has to make someone accountable, or else nature will. This is Front and Center. I'm Pia Ontiveros. Thanks for joining us.